Hi, good morning and good afternoon. My name is Rachel Flynn. I'm a member of the Skoll Foundation team, and I'm excited to welcome you to this Skoll World Forum session, Beyond the Storm, Innovations for the Future of Philanthropy. We're honored to have this impressive group of speakers to learn from and engage with, and are so grateful to them for their time today. I don't know about you, but I've really been looking forward to this one. I want to share a few quick items before we begin. The session is being recorded and will be released publicly after the event. Language translation is available. For this session, you can access the translation options in the translation tab to the right of the video window. Please feel free to use the chat to engage with each other and pose questions to our speakers. The moderator will turn to audience questions towards the end of the session. On social media, we're using the hashtag SkollWF and would love for you to do the same. After the session, you can join small group roundtable discussions on related topics by clicking the Discuss and Meet Up button on the left side of the video screen. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague and Skoll Foundation President, Marla Blow.
Thank you so much. It is such a pleasure to be here with all of you, and looking forward to a fantastic discussion today about philanthropy, about where we find ourselves at this time and how philanthropy has been called on to step up and grow and reckon with the time that we are in, and perform in ways that are new and that present opportunity for significant change. So why don't I start with framing up what we are here to discuss, and then I will bring in the members of the panel to discuss this alongside us. I will be joined by William Foster, who is the managing partner of the Bridgespan Group, Jen Ford Reedy, the president of the Bush Foundation, and Rakesh Rajani, who's the vice president of programs at Co-Impact. So really looking forward to jumping into this conversation, because philanthropy has long been critiqued, right, for falling short of the true transformational systems change that it suggests and purports to seek. And in particular, over the course of the last few years, through the pandemic, in the post-George Floyd era with racial reckoning and Black Lives Matter, we've really been called in, I would say, to reckon with the power that we have in philanthropy and lean into the responsibility that we bear to shift some of the inequities and some of the unjust systems that are present in our society and around the globe. Each member of this panel is recognized and has stepped into those innovations and work toward creating some of those systems. And in the midst of that kind of turmoil, there's opportunity. And what we're seeing is some real demonstration of what it looks like to step into this moment and meet the call for change. We're excited to see things that we will hear a lot more about in terms of big bets in philanthropy, in terms of activating broader pieces of the system and of the organizations themselves in terms of foundations. And yet there's still meaningful work to be done around providing support to and making grants to and making capital available to communities of color, to women-led organizations, and to finding people who are proximate to the challenges that they seek to solve. So with that as a lead-in, why don't I start with you, Rakesh, and talk a bit about Co-Impact, about your role as a major collaborative funder and how you've shifted over the last 2 years.
Thank you, Marla, and hello, everyone. Really glad to be here. Let me start by asking, what does 94027 mean for you? It's the zip code for Atherton, California, likely the first or second wealthiest zip code in America. It's a community that's 80% white, 13% Asian, where a one-bedroom apartment costs over $1 million, with the average household income in 2018 was $1.8 million. Now imagine if the residents and leaders of Atherton said, yes, we know there are problems in other places, in Erie, Pennsylvania, where the household income is $10,000 a year, to Livingston, Alabama, where 58% of the population is Black, or even to nearby East Palo Alto. We know there are problems there, but first we need to take care of our own backyard. Charity begins at home. How would we react if that's what they said? I think most of us would find that ridiculous. But then really, how different is that view from when the people and leaders of the richest country in the world, the US, use essentially the same argument to focus on the US over the rest of the world? I don't have the precise numbers at my fingertips, but something like 4 or 5% of US philanthropy is international. US giving goes to international causes. The rest is domestic. Routinely, when push comes to shove, international development is what gets left out. In response to COVID, the US government came up with a stimulus package, but very little of that went to the global south, to the countries most affected by it. In Africa today, only 16% of the population is fully vaccinated. In my own country, Tanzania, it's only 5%. Yet, just a few days ago, when the Senate was having negotiations on upping funding for COVID, the compromise that got them to agreement was to leave out funding for the global south. So if we are talking about innovation in philanthropy, perhaps the deepest innovation we need is around solidarity with the rest of the world, to not be parochial and think only about our country, about the US. And particularly, what would it take to get the right level of money in the right way to the right organizations in the global south? Allow me to talk about 5 innovations that we are trying out at Co-Impact as a result of listening and learning from our program partners. First, 100% of all our country level giving, and most of our grants actually go to country level, go to organizations that are rooted in the global south and are led by people with the lived experience, the contextual knowledge and relationships, and the legitimacy in the countries in which they work. This should be obvious and standard practice, but most philanthropy actually goes to intermediaries based in the global north, mostly led by white men. Second, we are committed to making at least 75% of our grants to organizations that are women-led. And recognizing the contribution of feminist groups to systems change in terms of shifting the narrative, for example, we will ensure that at least 10%, and I hope in practice it'll be much more, go to organizations that are feminist movements or women's rights organizations. Third, when we did our open calls for proposals, we realized that hundreds of women-led organizations in the global south could not compete with the terms we had to be able to do the large systems change that we were willing to offer. Not because they didn't have the ideas, but because they had not had the resources and the time to build up the capabilities to do systems change. As a result, now we make a new grant category. It's a 3-year grant. We call it the catalytic grant, that only goes to women-led organizations in the global south, that provides them the on-ramp they need for 3 years that will allow them to then do the much more deeper systems change work that we like to fund for the larger sums of money we support. Fourth, our grants, relatively speaking, are typically large enough and long-term enough to do systems change. They range typically from between $2 and $10 million, and they range in time for 3 to 6 years. We can't give $50,000, $100,000 grants for 1 or 2 years and expect there to be deep change. And fifth, perhaps the most important innovation we have is what we call the design grant. We give this to all our program partners who do large-scale systems change. The design grant is up to $500,000 over 7, 8, 9 months, which allows the leaders and the whole organization to step back and to think deeply about how they will bring about this change. During this time, the organization clarifies its purpose, mission, goals. It does deep listening and an analysis to understand why the problems exist. They hone in their strategy. And this is critical because when they do this, typically what happens is they move from service delivery to systems change, from asking the question, how can we do more of what we already do, to asking the question, what will it take to change the system and what can be our role in helping the system change? It helps them strengthen their key relationships and building powerful coalitions. And it also allows them to identify how they can strengthen their own internal capability. This commitment we make at the design grant at the beginning also then continues over the 5-year grant that we may make to them, where we support organizations not only to make a difference in the world, but we also support them to strengthen their own organization. In fact, we define impact and success with 3 metrics, and each one of these 3 are important. One is impact on the lives of millions of people. Second is the system changing. And third is the organization more capable, more stronger, more powerful as a result. And I want to end with this point by underlining this point is that if we step back and look historically, how have we had the biggest changes in the world that we care about? It's because strong organizations and movements brought them about, not projects. And yet, a lot of philanthropic funding essentially funds projects. We treat program partners, we treat grantees as if they are managers, subcontractees of our vision. And by doing that, we strip them of soul, we strip them of capacity, we strip them of purpose and coherence. So I think the most important innovation that philanthropy can work on, if there's one thing we need to get right, is to ask ourselves, is our model of support and funding, will it leave the organizations that we support more stronger, more powerful, more coherent, more independent as a result of our support? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. And Rakesh, that is incredible. There is a lot for us to unpack, and we'll look forward to digging in and having a bit more depth on some of what you've mentioned here. In particular, I'm struck by kind of the size and term of what you mentioned as one of the key dimensions of creating the opportunity for that change that you're seeking. So really powerfully said. Thank you for that. Jen, let's bring you into the conversation a bit here and touch on some of what we talked about and what we know you're doing with community trust funds. And tell us more about the community trust fund that you recently invested in, how that came about, how that aligns with the type of systems change you're hoping to create.
Absolutely. And first, I'll just say what a pleasure it is to be here. I had really been looking forward to all being together in shared space, but I'm also really happy to get to invite you into my living room here in Minnesota. There are a lot of ways at the Bush Foundation that we're changing how we work. So actually, a lot of them similar to some of the themes that Rakesh was laid out earlier. So I'm excited to continue that conversation. But this particular innovation that I'm going to talk about now is actually pretty different than our core work. And it's something that we think of as reparative action, not reparations. I think reparations has a very specific meaning, and we don't want to dilute that concept. But we think there's an opportunity for all private institutions, all individuals with wealth to think about what reparative action could look like for them. So, what did we do? We give away money every day. It's our business. And we also give a lot focused on racial equity and focused on wealth gaps. So that's not unusual. What was unusual for us is two things. One is that we issued in 2020 social impact bonds equal to 10% of our total assets at the time. And this allowed us to give more now, all above and beyond our regular grant making, while still looking out for the long term interests of the region that we serve. Um, and then we offered all the proceeds to establish community trust funds for Black and Native people in our region to access to pursue wealth building activities. So, whether that's going to school, buying a home, or starting a business. And we sought two community led organizations to serve as steward organizations and receive the money from us. And they're now designing how it will work with the communities they serve. And when they're ready, we will give them each $50 million to redistribute. For those of you who have read Edgar Villanueva's book, Decolonizing Wealth, you may recognize some part of this strategy. He suggests actually that all foundations tithe 10% to Black and Native individuals as a way of sharing wealth. So why did we do this? Whether or not your family has access to resources, access to wealth, makes a huge difference in your ability to weather challenges and to take advantage of opportunities. In fact, in the US, family wealth is the greatest predictor we have of all sorts of life outcomes. And in this way, wealth is generational. And because it's generational, history matters. And so the impact of discriminatory policies way back in history can still be seen in wealth gaps today. And those wealth gaps are profound. So in the US, for every $1 in wealth that a white family has, a black family has 13 cents. And a native family, last time it was measured, had just 8 cents. And I think a lot of people understand slavery and the taking of land as profound injustices. And more people, I think, are making the connection between those injustices and racial wealth gaps of today. But I think a lot fewer people understand how many other public and private policies contributed to these gaps, including our greatest hits public policies. So things we celebrate as part of our American success story, like Social Security Act, housing programs, GI Bill, overwhelmingly benefited white Americans. So today in the US, there are 46 million adults who can trace their wealth back to the Homestead Act of 1862. And these advantages and disadvantages have compounded over generations. So, if we're serious about addressing racial wealth gaps, I'd argue it's one of the most important things we could do. We have to acknowledge our history and take counteraction, reparative action. So, these community trust funds are big deals for us. They're big in terms of money, but it's also a big deal for us spiritually as a reparative act, a restorative act. And we think it's good strategy too. The only way we will close racial wealth gaps is in changing who has access to opportunities to build wealth. And it's an extremely simple idea, really. Um, but we believe just giving money to people at the right time in the right spirit can sometimes make all the difference.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Jen. And I do just want to ask you one question while we're still just in the opening piece of this, and that is you found yourself in Minneapolis right in the thick of what ended up being a global response
Right,
to the
right.
moment and thrust into a much larger and very outsized um, global reaction. And I'm curious how much that contributed to the decisions that you made and including going down the path that you just described, which is a powerful demonstration of creative approach. How did that play in?
Well, I think that was an intense time, a challenging time for lots and lots and lots of people, lots of institutions around the world. But I do think it made a difference to be here, like a feeling of ownership and responsibility, and feeling exposed, in all the ways we've been doing good work or thinking we've been doing good work over time, and all the ways where systems are failing people. And I think it was actually in the first board meeting we had after George Floyd was murdered, that our board decided to take this action. And I think it was just, it doesn't matter what we've been doing, it's not enough. We've got to dig deeper. We've got to think bigger. We've got to think differently. And we've got to make commitments to make a bigger difference toward making this region truly work well for everyone in it.
Thank you for that. And that stands to reason and really powerful demonstration and example of it. Thank you in those community trusts. William, let's turn to you. And it's always great to see you. At Bridgespan, I know you are known for catalyzing big bet philanthropy among your partners. And what does it take and how does that work to unlock significant amounts of wealth? And how have the events of the last 2 years contributed and maybe shifted the calculus on how you go about doing that work?
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Marla. It's great to see you and to see everyone here. Bridgespan does work on catalyzing philanthropy. our work, the bridge in some sense of Bridgespan, is actually about working with philanthropy and nonprofit innovators and actors to unleash big bets for social change. We work exclusively with donors and doers focused on justice and equity, about 50-50. But in our philanthropy work, as you said, Marla, a huge focus is on unlocking big bets and flows of money, getting money off the sidelines to really working powerfully on issues of equity and justice. We talk a lot about the aspiration gap that we have researched, and the aspiration gap is both an aspiration gap of what philanthropy could do to address social problems, as you know, Rakesh talked about some of the limited flows to critical global problems. So there's a huge gap between the potential for philanthropy as a force for good and what it does. But interestingly, there's a huge aspiration gap in what philanthropists themselves want. The amount of their giving and the amount of their giving that goes to really difficult social change problems. Our own analysis shows that, and this is US analysis, shows that of the very richest Americans who are active in philanthropy, only 1.2% of their wealth per year goes to philanthropic activities. And contrast this with, say, the Giving Pledge, just as one example, but a really important example. Huge numbers of the wealthiest philanthropists intend to give half or all, you know, almost all of their wealth away, and all of us that, you know, that have the chance to invest in our 401k or retirement programs know that wealth has grown faster than 1.2%, and certainly those that are in the positions of wealth we're contemplating here have their assets compound at much higher rates. So despite a sincere desire to give away more wealth and to give it to all of the kinds of causes of equity and justice, it's simply not flowing. And so a huge part of our mission and purpose is to help unlock that. The events of the last 2 years are not of a different kind, but are of a different magnitude in bringing that gap to life. So over the last 2 years, wealth has exploded, particularly in tech and finance. And at the same time, the awareness of and the immediacy of so many of the most pressing social problems, whether it's the racial reckoning in the United States, the global pandemic, challenges to democracy in multiple countries, climate change studies, these have come to just a heated point that's more profound. And so that gap has become more pronounced. And what we've seen in our work is actually some positive trends for philanthropy over the last couple of years. It's too early to say how widespread they are. We obviously work with not a random sample of philanthropists, and are in conversation with a set that's more action oriented, leaning more into closing this gap. But what we've seen is I would say 5 different things. One is more big betting, simply increasing the size of the gifts. You know, Jen shared how their philanthropy leaned in, the Ford Foundation leaned in, individual donors have put more out into the field. We've just seen simply larger gift amounts. The second is a beginning of a shift to more trust-based philanthropy. So fewer programmatic restrictions, more of a willingness to give unrestricted grants, the kind that truly have the potential to strengthen organizations and allow them to pursue their own work. The third is actually beginning to lean into an appreciation and a beginning to lean into more advocacy, narrative change, systems change oriented grants. A lot of philanthropists start with just a basic reaction of saying, we don't do that. But as the depth of the systemic problems has become more shared, more visible, there's been a sort of a willingness to lean into that. And you can see that whether it's Co-Impact, that Rakesh is part of, Blue Meridian, TED Audacious, a number of these donor collaboratives are leaning into systems change more, or advocacy of one flavor or another more powerfully. And then the fourth that I would say is a strong desire to consciously shape the portfolio of grantees to have more proximate leaders, whether that's on the global dimension, having leaders from within the region, or on racial dimensions, having people that have more lived experience with some of the challenges, or the gender dimension. And I would say that among the set of more ambitious strategic grant makers, we've seen shifts on all of those dimensions over the past 2 years in a way that were happening, but happening more slowly over the prior two. I think the jury is still out on how widespread those shifts are, how enduring those shifts are. But I think there's some reason for optimism about the past 2 years, and particularly the sort of yawning gap, I would say, as wealth has grown and problems have become more appreciated. And then the final note I'll just share, Marla, on this is one of the innovations that I think is really important for civil society is the growth of donor collaboratives, of multi-donor platforms. And we can get into that if it's of interest more later, but we have seen a pretty significant expansion in the number of those platforms, the number of donors participating in each platform, and the amount of money committed to each of those platforms. And it seems to be an important vehicle for both overcoming some of the very sort of human barriers to giving more proximately, giving more ambitiously, and also to overcoming some of the literally the mechanisms needed to do good grant making, to have shared support and services. So even more so than the growth of individual donors acting individually, the willingness to put a part of the portfolio into these multi-donor collaboratives seems to hold a lot of promise for the coming decade.
Thank you for that. And you see so much across the philanthropic sector, so it's really powerful to hear your thoughts on that. So one of the things I want to add, and I do want to make sure to invite the audience here, please do put questions you may have, or any of these threads that have been raised here and highlighted that you'd like to hear a little bit more about, or like to pull on, or double click, whatever metaphor you'd like to use. Please put that in the chat and we'll work that into the conversation here. One of the things I want to share about my own thinking around philanthropy and some of the opportunities, and one of the big driving forces for me in joining Skoll and taking the role I'm in, is because of the opportunity to look at all of the levers at the disposal of a foundation like ours, where we sit on a significant endowment and we make decisions every day about where that endowment is allocated. It picks up a little bit on what Jen was saying about making decisions every day on where we grant dollars. Similarly, we can make decisions about where we invest dollars. And we've been impact investors from the beginning. So there's sort of the clear description of and commitment to the things we do not invest in, right? We don't have an oil and gas portfolio that we have to divest of, or any long-standing commitments like that, and have built a meaningful presence in renewable energy, clean tech, in partnership with Capricorn Asset Management, which does our asset management efforts. We are now looking at how we allocate capital in ways that create opportunity for wealth building, that create opportunity for ownership, that broaden out economic participation, that can focus on racial justice and put some capital on the commercial side of what we do, where we are seeking those commercial returns for our portfolio and for our endowment growth. Those are opportunities as well. And those are, in many instances, those opportunities are significant and can play a meaningful role in helping drive that change from another dimension. So we have the opportunity to look at both sides of the house, what we're doing from a grant perspective and what we're doing from an investment perspective, and how we engage on the capital markets side. And I'm really excited to do that here at Skoll and bring that to life. And I'm looking forward to the balance of the foundation sector also looking into and taking advantage of the opportunity to activate that endowment and look at some of the other opportunities. Jen, I think you described it very nicely about one of the creative ways to go about doing that. One of the things I want to pick up, there's a question that's come in from the audience that I'll bring in here, and we'll continue the conversation. But the question of risk has come up here, right? For people that are doing innovative community work, taking on deep challenges faced in society, it's risky, right? Like that work is demonstrably, right, understood that it's high risk, also has potential for meaningful change, and we call that high reward. How can this sector, right, what opportunities are there to make that decision-making power turn it over to the impacted people in spaces where there might be resistance or where there might be risk aversion in some cases that might be surprising? And Rakesh, I'd love to pull you back into the conversation here for any thoughts you might have on that, and then open up to the entire panel.
Thank you very much, Marla. This is a really important question that we grapple with all the time. So look, I mean, if anybody should be able to take risks, it's philanthropy, right? We don't have taxpayers and a number of others on it. So it's our job to take risks. And I think that's what we should be doing. Now, I don't think one just blindly takes risks. I think one should measure these things. We do that all the time and kind of get what is the right level of risk to take, and how do we manage the risk? How do we support our partners to manage the risks? And I think once you start unpacking that, what you find is a lot of what we call risk is sometimes just flat out discrimination, right? These sort of people, I'm not sure we can trust them. They don't have the experience. They don't have the capacity. I've been a grantee for 25 years, and I could tell lots of people coming and saying, could we really trust this person because he doesn't look like one of us, he doesn't have the same experience, he didn't go to the same schools with us, and so forth. So I think we need to question a lot of our risk concern. Is that just our flat out discrimination? Second, I think it really helps to have people making those decisions be much more proximate to the communities and contexts in which they work. So when in the case of Core Impact, for example, we now have developed teams of people in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, and when they are making the decisions, in consultation with local advisors, they're better informed and better able to calculate the risks and how to manage the risks. And when it becomes a conversation with your partner around how do we manage risks rather than we deciding for them, I think it becomes a much more meaningful conversation.
Thank you for that. Jen, you gave a powerful example of empowering the communities. Anything else you want to add on top of that?
Well, I really agree with what Rakesh said. But I'd amplify, that we do have capacity to take risk in philanthropy, and of course, we don't want to be casual about it, because I think there's sort of what part is the risk that we put the money in and we don't get to celebrate a success with the strategic decision we made, versus how did this actually impact the lives of people who were involved in the initiative, the lives by people who were affected. And I think even the idea of, we see people really, really rally around something and it doesn't work. It's not just the cost of that failure. It's what does that mean for people's hope and their willingness to come together again around a solution. So we don't want to be casual about that. And I think there's a big opportunity for people working in philanthropy and people who are making pitches to philanthropy to reframe how we talk about risk and to say, we're excited about this as a risk. Because I think sometimes foundations say, we want to be a risk taker. And then you put something in front of them and they're like, whoa, this seems a little risky. So I think there's a bit of like, how do you say, good news? This is a really risky idea. It may not work. And actually, then I think you can shift people's mindset sometimes and actually get people excited about recognizing the risk they're taking and the power in the risk they're taking. But sometimes it requires just a different way of, even decision by decision, reframing and talking about what the opportunity is.
Absolutely right. William, anything you want to add to this one before we jump into another question?
Yeah, I would add two thoughts. First is philanthropy should be the risk capital of social change, but there are a lot of strong, very basic human psychological reasons why neither program officers nor the wealthiest philanthropists choose to pursue that path. So it does push on some basic personal reward, personal incentives that I think we all need to work to change. The second thought I would offer is that one of the reframes around risk taking and power and trust that we've seen become effective is, touches on what Rakesh brought up earlier on about thinking about less about programmatic grants and programmatic goals and more about institution building. The greatest success stories across the history of philanthropy are about building fields within civil society that pursue change for decades. Think about the civil rights movement. Think about in the United States history, the building of conservative institutions predating the Reagan revolution and sort of rebirth of conservative ideology. It's generally about building institutions. And when we can shift our thinking, which many philanthropies have done, from within 5-year programmatic outcomes to institution building, all of a sudden it opens the doorway to think about risk less as what are the odds a specific goal happens in the next 3 or 4 years, but what's our distinctive contribution in building critical and strong institutions? And we can come to it later, but one of the great gaps in philanthropic giving is that both the size of the gift and the nature of gifts, so endowment giving, are very pronounced within medical research, within higher education, but are almost fully absent. Fewer than 5% of the biggest gifts to social change organizations go to endowments. And a colleague, Darren Isom, and I have been doing a lot of research and work around this topic, but both endowments specifically to social change, specifically to Black-led organizations, can make a profound difference. But really, it's nestled in this thinking about building organizations. And I say that because it's actually a way to de-risk in donors' minds what might be otherwise perceived as risky actions.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly, and I think there's a lot that's been shared here. There are a number of directions we could go in, but I think picking up on that thread about risk, and there's another question that's come in that I think actually ties into the next step beyond that, which is about learning, right? And what does it mean to learn, and in particular, to learn from failure, right? We've just touched on some of the risks that are being taken, and what we find lacking in some instances by the audience is asking is about failure and about the ability, the tendency to then kind of contract and go back to prior practices when there has been failure. I'll actually add a bit about some of the, and just highlight that one of the big investments we are making at Skoll internally is on the learning side of the conversation. In particular, being able to collect back from our awardees and our grantees and others that are actively engaged in this space, and some of our systems orchestrators and network participants, is the information gathering, right? Being able to collect and understand what they see, what they are closer to, and in many cases actively day-to-day involved in the work, and can provide us with some context, with some understanding and some insight. And what we want is to create the space for them to feel comfortable saying, hey, we tried these things, here's some stuff that worked, here's some stuff that didn't, and not have that feel like in and of itself, it's introducing even more risk by being able to talk about failure, right? Part of what we discussed is creating a safe space, right? So that it feels comfortable and allows us to do the learning that's being asked of here. And I think it's critical to being able to take that risk and then understand what to do in light of what has come about by taking that risk. But maybe I'll open up to the group here, and Jen, maybe we'll start with you this time. Just talk a bit about some of what you've already seen from the community trust, from some of the other things you've done, and how you're learning and how you think you'll be able to ultimately capitalize on some of the risks you have taken.
Well, I don't have much to say yet on the community trust because that's pretty fresh work for us. But in a whole lot of other ways, we have failed and we have learned. And I think about, if we didn't fail sometimes, then that would be a good indication that we're not thinking enough about risk taking. But I also think there are good failures and not good failures. And, it can be a good failure if you've really contributed to knowledge, learned something that others can build on. It can be a good failure if there ends up being another unintended consequence that actually is is a positive, a new solution, a new idea comes from, right? So there are other ways. But I think the best way to ensure that you end up with a good failure is actually really, really, really consistent with what William and Rakesh have been saying, which is the notion of building capacity toward whatever your goal is. So if you have some idea you want to test, some goal you're going toward, the more your strategy is about building building system capacity, organizational capacity toward that goal, the more likely you are to have something good come from the work. Because even if the particular idea that animated the work in the beginning doesn't turn out to be the right idea, you've built the problem solving capacity, you've built the execution capacity, you've built the connective relationships and ability to work together that should allow for next phase work that can learn from and adapt and continue to move work forward, rather than saying, oh, it's a failure, we're now going to have to start over on some other idea with some other coalition.
How about you, Rakesh? Thoughts on learning and where you are in terms of making those investments and being on that journey?
Thanks, Marla. This is one of my favorite questions, and I appreciated what you said, Jen. So, I think two things are almost critical to get this right. The first is at an organization, and particularly the organization's leadership, has to convey a sense of deep curiosity, right? So if you go and speak to among your staff, and you're not just asking, what have we achieved? Show me the results. But you're also asking, hey, we thought we will achieve some impact by doing this. Are we? How will we know? What are we learning? And you show a level of enthusiasm and deep curiosity for that. I think setting that culture and practice is absolutely crucial. And unfortunately, in too many organizations, I feel the learning, measurement, evaluation sits in a box, and somebody is supposed to take care of that while the rest of us just kind of do our work. So that's number one. And number two, I really think it's on us as donors, right? If we set up a relationship where our program partners, our grantees, experience us as deeply curious and wanting to learn from them, understand that life is not just a kind of straight line, that there will be steps forward, steps back. And if we say that the thing we care about the most is to understand how you learn, can you give us some examples of how you learn? Can we laugh together on things that didn't go well because we got certain things wrong, our hypothesis? That level of empathy and curiosity and understanding, I think, creates the conditions that give license, that create an authorizing environment for people to learn. And the irony is, of course, it's not only a good thing to do, but it actually will bring better results and more impact in the medium to long term. So I think those are really key. I'll perhaps just say that at Co-Impact, we have a whole guide on this, and I just posted the link on the comment channel. So I hope people will find that useful in terms of how we approach it.
Thank you. Yep. And William, again, you see so much across the field. What are you seeing, and how does that factor in what you're seeing?
I mean, I'll just make one short comment on this, because I know the chat and questions are exploding, Marla. So I want to make sure we hit sort of as many of the questions as we can. But I think that one of the questions this learning brings up is where the center of gravity for idea creation sits. Does it sit with the donor, or does it sit with the doers in the field? And the more it sits, and not to say there's an inherently right or wrong answer, although I'll be clear about my bias, the more it sits with the donor, the more there is risk of failure for the grantees. They don't fulfill the specific role that was envisioned for them. But the more it's either collaborative or really maybe even sits with the doers, the more they're, I think, empowered to learn and evolve. And we all like to be the idea generator. So it's hard to truly, as philanthropists, sit with the ideas of others. But it's an important thing to at least be conscious of in grant making strategies.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Let's take another one. Let's pick up on the question of how can philanthropy help fund, build, incentivize movement and cross-organizational capabilities, as opposed to funding organization institutionalizing. In other words, how does this sector kind of operate collectively and build build a movement more broadly versus engaging individually, one-off, with one organization at a time, and each foundation, for example, also functioning one at a time. And Rakesh, a lot of your work, I think, points to this. Maybe here, start with you on what you're seeing in that, what that brings up for you.
Yeah, again, I think the key, it starts with listening, right? It's the point William was making also just now around where is the center of gravity? Are we, sometimes I think that donors we should be banned from having our own strategies, because when we have too many strategies, it crowds out the space for the partner strategy. Our strategy should fit on half a page, which simply says, this is what we're going to focus on, and maybe these are the locations. That's it, because when we do that, it creates room to listen to what our program partners are thinking. What is the logic of their thinking? How is it that they want to move? And a lot of the times what you realize is they realize that the structure of the change that they want to bring doesn't fit neatly into here are the, here's the activities, and here's the outputs, and here's the outcomes, and this is how you'll measure them in 1 year, right? And a lot of that is often around relationship building. It's about re-knitting what has been torn apart by coming together. It is about creating space for people who are holding 3 jobs and doing 17 things, who don't have a public infrastructure and public transport to be able to navigate life. So they are just living harried lives. So maybe the first step is to kind of mitigate that harried life first, right? So that people can kind of come together again to have the collective spaces in which to think and do that work. So my sense is just creating this time for listening first allows you to know how to then structure your support and then building. And then I do think, if you ask me, and I know I'm kind of answering this in a sideways way, but I hope it's useful. If you ask me, from my, I've been in philanthropy for about 6.5 years, and for 25 years before that, I was on the other side. What is the number one constraint that people face in terms of achieving the large scale impact that they want to achieve? Lack of money is a problem, but I don't think that's the number one problem. Can ideas be sharper? Yes, but I don't think that's the number one problem. What is the biggest problem? The biggest problem we have is that leaders of movements, leaders of organizations are running around trying to do 1,000 things, trying to raise money, trying to do projects, trying to take care of HR, to work on systems, IT. It's so much that life is fragmented and distracted and busyness. What one needs to do is to support leaders to center, to find that quiet center of coherence and focus, from which they can emerge with what is really important and feel empowered and feel licensed to say no to 17,000 other good things, so that they can focus on the 3 most important things. How do we support doing that? And too much of the time, we add to the problem, because we go in with our ideas and our questions and 10,000 other things and just pile it on. Less is more, and I think we need to figure out how to create that deep centered self to do the deep impact.
Yeah, thank you for that. And it definitely brings up a couple of thoughts on my end as well about the importance of, as we are organizing and working collectively and focusing on creating bigger movements, it is about being able to centralize, right, and rely on reporting that might be created once rather than reporting that has to be created specifically for each funder at each round. And those are things that I believe as a sector we are all starting to embrace, right, is the recognition that each idiosyncratic question, each idiosyncratic requirement runs contrary to, I think, what's being asked in this question, right, which is about building a collective, right, and enabling a movement versus introducing kind of a service requirement, right, and kind of the care and feeding of the funder as each organization ultimately having to invest in that runs contrary to that. Rather than go through round robin on that one, let me ask another one that's come up, and William, we'll start with you on this one. This one is about the role of intermediaries. So picking you and non-randomly picking you to start off with this one. Talk about the role of intermediaries, right? When and how do intermediaries create value and create opportunity versus creating roadblocks? And as philanthropists who believe in trust-based philanthropy and trust-based giving, rely on the intermediaries for decisions, does that end up bypassing some organizations? And is the intermediary able to have eyes on the radar screen to be able to identify the authentic organizations doing great work?
Yeah. There's an enormous amount of untapped potential for intermediaries in the space, and that's probably more true today than it was 5 or 10 or 15 years ago. So groups like Co-Impact are in many ways a very value-added intermediary between donors and on-the-ground organizations. And in a U.S. context, community foundations are an underutilized intermediary, groups that really know the players on the ground. What we see them enable, whether it's multi-donor platforms or community foundations, is a way of giving access to ambitious donors, giving access to leaders and groups that are maybe multiple steps outside their inner circle. So one of the very natural things that donors tend to do is to build some walls to protect themselves from solicitations. Lots of folks come at them. And as a result, they tend to build walls into which a trusted set of people are given access. So that's a very natural thing. But of course, who they are already in relationship with is not a random or fairly or equitably distributed asset. And so intermediaries can be the release valve to allow donors to get to organizations they won't. And sometimes there are even legalistic benefits that can come. So many organizations in the global South do not have US-based 501c3s to enable them to receive checks. So sometimes there are really important things that an intermediary can do. The place where it can become a barrier or redundant gets back actually to something Rakesh said, which is, do they have their own highly developed strategy? Because now if they're a filter that narrows what can be done because of, so if a funder has a strategy and an intermediary has a strategy, there's definitely no room left for the on-the-ground organizations to have strategies. So I think that's, intermediaries could be all kinds of different flavors. Obviously, Bridgespan are one, and it's something we wrestle with internally because we develop strategies. We would like strategies. We're at our most effective when we're clear about the kinds of issues and organizations and donors we want to work with. But then once we're just clear on those bookends, we bring other people's work to life.
Thank you for that. We are running close to time, so why don't we do this? Let's do one last round and the last word from each. And Jen, we'll start with you. A question for the entire panel, and that is, what is one thing you would hope that philanthropy would leave behind, and one thing that you hope philanthropy will carry forward?
Well, I think in terms of leave behind, there's a lot in our conventional wisdom and status quo around philanthropy that I hope we're shedding. I think this has been an opportunity for us to change mindsets and realize we can do everything differently. I mean, almost everything, right? We have a few legal constraints, but we can do a whole lot differently. And I think, I believe there are lots of ways to do good philanthropy. I would never say every foundation should do this or that, or every funder should do this or that. But I do hope more of us embrace what I would call the strategic value of followership, which I think has been a lot of what we've talked about here. That we pride ourselves on leadership, identifying issues, making things happen in a narrow, specific way, and this goal that we've set. And I think so much has to go right to have big transformative systems change happen. People have to be fired up and ready to do the hard work. Stakeholders have to be ready to support it. The funding and policy environments have to be conducive to the change. So I hope that rather than so many of us, setting those change agendas, I hope more of us will work on building our skills to recognize when the conditions are right for big change to happen. And then getting on board and being strategic followers and funding those people who have the vision and are ready to make it happen.
Thank you so much for that. William, why don't we go to you next, and then Rakesh, we started with you. We'll end. We'll give you the last word. But William, what would you say is what you're seeing that you'd like and hope we'll carry forward, and the things that you're happy to see us leave behind?
Yeah. On the things that are being adopted, the thing from a philanthropy standpoint that I would love to see people continue to lean into much more is more of a portfolio mindset. And by portfolio mindset, I don't mean across issue areas, criminal justice, climate, etc., but I mean across types of philanthropy. Here's the portion of work in which we, the philanthropy, are deeply expert and hands-on and select. Here's the portion that we do with structured multi-donor collaboratives. Here's the portion, to Jen's point, that are about followership of other great organizations. Here's the portion that we want to use to endow critical community organizations that have not been endowed. To think about the financial channels and vehicles the way we would think about commercially investing, as opposed to saying our strategy is one of these things. And I think that can open the landscape to really energizing and joyful and effective but bigger donations. And the thing I hope folks will be ready to leave behind is more money. or maybe, hold on, maybe logically it's the reverse. Leave behind less money.
Right. Yes, I got you. I understood the directionality of what you meant. Well said. Rakesh, you get to close us out.
Thank you.
What do you hope, and what do you hope we will continue, and what do you hope we will leave behind and stop doing?
Great. Well, I love what Jen and William said. I think I'm going to steal that phrase, the strategic value of followership. Earlier, William, when you talked about the center of gravity of learning not being at the donor but at the program partner, I really love that. For those of us who are trying to be less patriarchal, one of the things we know is even if you think you're the smartest person in the room, don't show up in the room that tries to demonstrate that. Listen. And I really think when as funders, if you're in a room, if you're on a Zoom call with program partners, ask, how do you create the space to learn from? Maybe as part of our annual appraisals in philanthropy, we should all be asked to answer, what are the 5 things I've learned from my grantees this year, and how am I changing my practice and my thinking as a result? And then absolutely, we need to get much more money and much more flexible money out to the program partners. That's what trust means. That's what change requires. That'll be the final metric that we all need to hold ourselves accountable to.
Fantastic. Really appreciate that. So on behalf
Marla, I'd love to hear you answer that. We have 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Okay, we'll take the last 2 minutes, and I will chime in here. Thank you, William, for calling me in. I am really excited to see the continuation of, I think, being able to actually understand and identify who is in the portfolio and be deliberate and thoughtful about addressing gaps, right? Where there might be missing, whether that's demographics, whether that's proximity to a particular portion of society. Those are the kinds of measures that oftentimes just were not pursued in the past at all. And what you do not measure, you cannot change. And when I want to see the change I'd like to see is a change that reflects the inclusion of parts of the population that might not otherwise and previously have been a part of it. So I am excited to see that start. I'm glad to see that blindness left behind. I am hopeful that we will continue that and carry it forward in the future as a sector. So I will stop there. Thank you all so much. I want to say thank you to Rakesh. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, William, for being a part of this. And look forward to continuing these discussions over the course of the coming year. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.